This is a discussion about how to assess a planning application with a view to giving that applicant a permit. The purpose of this particular bit of content in the unit is to help you in your preparation for writing a planner's report, technical memo, whatever we like to call it. The piece of advice that the planning officer within a council pulls together to whoever is making the decision, whether that's the alderman or whether that's somebody who's got the delegated authority. This is the process that the person who's looking at that application goes through in order to make a recommendation and come up with a document that will go to the decision maker. So the purpose is to go through this example. Indra Boss, who has very kindly supplied us with all this information, has given us the Huon Valley information. So we're going to work through the Huon Valley planning scheme and not look at any particular example, but to look at the way in which a planner would go through an example, and you can use the case study within the unit to think about the particulars. There's a few things here at the front about local government, key concepts, and then we'll get into the mechanics of the permit application, and finally useful links which you should already have and which are in the online resource in Milo. So just a little bit of context about local government itself doesn't have independent legal standing. So local government exists because of the Local Government Act, and so this is important because in terms of all of the things that need to happen and the authority with respect to a planning application, local government is enabled to do its job through legislation that refers to other authorities. So the actual power with any particular aspect of a planning application lies under the appropriate act. So local government is given the power under the Local Government Act to engage with this process and make a decision. But in the case of the planning authority, it's all done under the Land Use Planning Approvals Act. In the case of something like roads, it comes under the Roads and Gs Act. So there's the actual planning that happens under LUPA, but then the planner needs to be aware that they don't have jurisdiction over all aspects, and it's really only planning matters. And I know we've said this a couple of times, but here's why. Local government is fairly tightly prescribed in terms of what they can and can't do. Also, and this goes to the last dot point on this slide, the person who's doing the application is rarely the person making the decision. In the case of a senior planner, it might be, but council is actually the elected representatives, and sometimes they delegate authority in the case of a permitted application that doesn't have any representations. Then maybe that won't go through to council, but the planner is not council, and the planner is not the person making the decision. They're an employee. So this is an important distinction, and one of the reasons why you need to be clear about what you can and can't say. So that's heads of power concept, that there are heads who have the power under different acts, and planning and is just the act. LUPA brings all that together and gives the planning officer and council certain role in that process, but you know, exactly where the power lies is something that planner needs to keep in mind. The other thing is that the specific overrides the general. So this is another reason not to give advice too early in the process, because you might look through all of the general intent of the legislation and the planning scheme and the application, but the specific details and the way it plays out in the zone and the codes matters and overrides the general. So be wary about giving any opinions, whatever, but particularly before you've had a chance to go through it in detail and figure out what's actually going on and how it relates to the planning scheme. This is a performance-based planning system in Tasmania. So you need to have your head around the acceptable solution and the performance criteria, and the difference between those two, and what happens when you can't meet the acceptable solution, and this relates to material that we've already covered. And then, yeah, all of the information that you start digging into in iPlan around ordnance, zone maps, all of those overlays that may reveal what you need to refer. So we'll go through a little bit of that. And what's called machine clauses, the parts of the planning scheme at the front that kind of give effect and set up the way things are done, and is needs to be understood before you go on and actually do the assessment. So all the applications involve assessment against the use. Most applications involve assessing against a development. Sometimes it can be assessing against a demolition or change of use, but for the purposes of today, we're talking about development. So this is the timeline that a planner is working towards. This should be familiar to you. The person who's wanting to put in the planning application comes in and lodges. The planner needs to figure out whether it's a valid application, which we'll come to in a minute, but we have covered this before, and does the initial assessment, and does that as thoroughly as possible, as quickly as possible, just in case it's not a straightforward application and other things need to be set in motion. So is all the main information there, and are referrals required, are 2 questions that come up early on. And this is done before it's advertised, and the next point there refers to public, because that's the next phase. So valid applications is essentially the planning application itself, the fees, a current certificate of title, which means from the last 30 days, that includes the schedule of easements. Otherwise you'll find yourself without a valid application. And it might also require a Section 52 application, which essentially means approval from the landowner. So Indra is saying this often happens in the Huon Valley because there's lots of land owned by the Crown, and you can tell that it's owned by the Crown, or there's an indication that it's owned by the Crown. When you go into iPlan, it doesn't list the owner, it says null. So that's a fair indication that that approval needs to be sought. So this is what we're having a look at today, essentially in the guts of what we're going through. So this is what the planner fills out for either permitted or discretionary application under the Huon Valley Interim Planning Scheme. And you can see that right at the start of this document, there's all the basics about who's doing it, the site address, things that the system needs to get things going, the lodgement date, which is really important in terms of starting the clock, and yeah, then under the planning scheme provisions, the second part of this, the zone, the use classification. Remember, all applications need a use, even if they don't fit particularly well, they have to be allocated to a use class, use status, and any codes. So the standard ones in here are parking and stormwater, but there might be others that apply, and this has to be sorted out pretty early. In Huon Valley, there aren't many specific area plans, but if you're working in the city of Hobart, this is something that might come up. And yeah, then the next part, so to go back to, so okay, so you've got the guts of the application, you have this template that I've just put in front of you, and then you've got the planning scheme. So you have these things open. Parts A, B and C, and I've shown you a screenshot here from the Huon Valley Interim Planning Scheme in iPlan, are what are called the machinery clauses that guide that assessment. And so these set out the purposes and objectives and the way you administer it, and a planner will get to know these and not need to keep referring to them. But just to, I guess, make the point that everything should be, in theory, everything is in the scheme. So you're not having to flick back to other documents. You've got the planning scheme in front of you, you've got the actual submitted application, and you've got your template. So things that relate to policy, in particular with capital letters state policy, is assumed to be in the scheme. That might not actually happen in practice, which is problematic, but it's assumed that it's there. So you're not going out, you're not allowed to go outside when you're doing the application assessment. So the next part is to look at the zone. We've done that. So this is just to remind you to look at the applicable codes. So this is pretty standard here, parking and stormwater. Yeah, you have to look at the individual application to see what might apply. The next part looks at referrals. So most of these are relatively straightforward. Some of them perhaps less so. Department of State Growth, Heritage, Tasmanian Planning Commission, Tas Networks, Forest Practices, etc. And Tas Water there as a separate, as well as the internal referrals. So who else within the Huon Valley needs to see this? So planning is the first point of contact. Who else does this need to go to? The next part of the template prompts you to put in a summary of the proposal, have a look through the records. So this is where the council planner does a lot of desktop work. Given the size of the council, of some rural councils, it might not always be possible for the planner to go on site. Wherever possible, planners try to do that, particularly if it looks like it might be complicated. Always if there's a representation, because if it goes through to appeal, it's important that the final assessment, the planner has been on site and really has they're very sure about the advice that they're providing. So the any historic building permits, any correspondence, and note all of these. So if there needs to be a request for information, then it's not done repeatedly, that this is all dealt with as part of a smooth process. The site locality, here are the prompts, zoning, overlays, surrounding land, and all of that contextual information is really important when the planner's making a decision about whether this should go ahead or not, or what advice to provide. Sorry, they're not the decision maker. Then it prompts for issues around stability, hazards, bushfires, possibility of threatened native vegetation in the area, might this need a flora and fauna assessment, etc. And then you get into the actual assessment. So you start going down to the uses. So is this a sensitive use? Is this visitor accommodation? So the template is a long document, and the planning officer is going to need to go through and delete what's not applicable and then write something in here. So there's a couple of different options here. So we've gone with, you would obviously would have to say it complies and it doesn't comply, but this is what you might write, that the use complies and here's supporting information. So it's really clear what the assessment is being based on and where to find that supporting information. Or it doesn't comply because it's not compliant with the Child Care Act. So in essence, the guts of the decision, the guts of the advice is here. Other matters further down the form, again, a prompts around heritage, Aboriginal heritage, geotech, parking, these sorts of things are prompted because it's difficult to keep all of this in your head. Obviously, when you're an experienced planner, you probably don't need these prompts, but these are all in the documentation just in case. And finally, the recommendation at the end. So this is what the planner writes that goes up to either the delegated authority, which might be the senior planner, more likely in the case of the Huon Valley, go to council meeting, and then the relevant bit gets filled out here, so that the application be approved subject to conditions, and there might be lots of conditions. There's only an example in here, but it might be 1 through 12, or that all gets deleted, and that the application be refused gets moved up, a permit be refused, and the details here. So this is what, once this is completed, this is what the planner submits, and then we're in this part of the assessment timeline where the final assessment is done and it moves over to council to make a decision. If there's any appeals or any representations want to contest the council's decision, they then take it to appeal, which is why it's important for the planner to have kept really good records. So details of what's going up to council are public. So this is a screenshot from the Huon Valley Council meetings page. So here's the agenda, the minutes, and actually the audio recordings. Some councils have video recordings. Glenorchy City Council makes video recordings of their meetings, and so you can go in ahead of time and see what's being proposed. If you wish, you can go and listen to discussion. You can't be part of discussion, but you can sit and show physically that you're interested in that particular agenda item. So this is, again, some of the mechanics of how this assessment works. The timing is important, the detail is important, version control of documents is important. So the initial assessment might be labelled P1 in the system, and then if it's amended, if there's a request for further information, it's amended, that might end up with P2. The final assessment would be clearly labelled, and so you've got all of that documentation of what happened through the process. So if it does go to appeal and the Resource Management and Planning Appeals Tribunal want all that documentation, easy peasy. You need to provide sufficient information to council, whether that's the senior planner or the alderman, to make a decision, and all of these templates need to be filled out. So we do have a blank example of the Huon Valley assessment form, the delegation report, which is part of that, the general manager delegation report, and the council reports, which are on the web page. So there's a couple of examples there. If you want to see what a refusal or an approval looks like, then you can go in and have a look at those. So this is what is kept by way of process in terms of documents, and it's an important part of keeping track of the process. So this is done in an electronic management system. Councils have different systems, but they all keep a track of any correspondence to the applicant, such as a RFI, request for further information, the initial assessment, a referral, like an email to Tas Water, the documentation that was sent. You can see all of that with the dates, so that it's really clear what's happened, when it's happened. Given that councils, a lot of councils deal with stuff electronically, things are not actually stamped, but the stamp still appears even though it's done electronically. So this is an example of a plan that has been assessed, and you can see there the stamps on that Huon Valley Council permit document that's been approved. So this is an important document to keep a record of. These stamps are important to show that this is the version that's been approved. And finally, you should all be familiar with these, but these are the useful websites that you need to use as part of your role as council planner.